All right, there we go. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to share some of this data. All right, so I'm going to be talking about results from two different GEM publications. One was the Women's Entrepreneurship 2021, where we had the first measures around the pandemic, and then we did a follow-up report at the request of the Women's Entrepreneurship Financing Initiative, housed at the World Bank, looking more deeply at women in emerging economies. So for those of you unfamiliar with the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, or GEM program, this data is the world's foremost study of entrepreneurship. Really, it's probably the most innovative research methodology collected in the most countries. It's based on the concept of a process view of business startup and growth, and dissolution, so business closures, based on an adult population survey. We have 20 plus years of data for over 100 countries, and with many thanks to our sponsors this year, Babson, Cartier Women's Initiative, WeFi, Smith College, and the École de Gestion in Freiburg. So I'm just going to walk through. I want to give you some highlights, just to give you a feel for what this data has to say about women's entrepreneurship. And then I'm going to talk about a couple of issues or framing that I think would be really helpful from a research perspective going forward. So today, based on the GEM data, we estimate that there are over 400 million women business owner managers worldwide. About 274 million of these women are actually in the process of starting and running new businesses, so less than 42 months old. And another 139 million women globally are running established businesses, so over 42 months of age. Now, many businesses don't make it to 42 months, and then once established, that population tends to be smaller. This is true for men as well. But we're really interested in the people who are just starting businesses, because that data gives us an indicator of how things might, it's a leading indicator, right, for how things might be changing globally. All right. Okay, so top line number, and one of the most important things I want you to know about this data, we have a tendency, oops, okay. We have a tendency to focus on the same old story when it comes to women's entrepreneurship, right? We're always comparing them to men. So it's always women are leading men. So globally, in this year's report, with the unique country sample we had this year, about 11% of women globally were starting businesses compared to 14% of men. So, and that 3% gap is big when you're looking at billions of people. So we usually present the story that way, but with the GEM Women's Report, we're really trying to draw attention to the contributions that women are making. And we find that 1 in 3 entrepreneurs globally, so those with businesses less than 42 months old, are growth-oriented entrepreneurs worldwide are actually women. So 1 out of 3 of the entrepreneurs who want to grow big, successful businesses are female. And that's where you get this question of why aren't we investing more in supporting the aspirational entrepreneurs that happen to be female? Because our system is largely designed not to help women grow those businesses. But despite the barriers, women represent 42% of all entrepreneurs worldwide. 1 out of 3 with high growth expectations, 1 out of 5 who are starting their business less than 42 months with over 20 employees. 1 out of 3 have innovative offerings. These are self-reports, but they're saying that they're offering products and services that don't currently exist in their market. Almost 1 out of 3 of the entrepreneurs involved in high exports, so having 25% or more of their customers outside the country, are female. And again, when we are looking at the adult population survey, we're looking at who's involved also in investing in entrepreneurship, and we find that 40% of informal investors around the world are female. So women are making a very big impact. And this begs the question about why the negative stereotypes persist around women's entrepreneurship. And from a social theory standpoint, I'm a sociologist by training. We really, it's self-fulfilling prophecy, right? How what others believe in us or how we view ourselves actually influences our actions, and then the judgments of others and how they treat us, which reinforces our beliefs. And we have this cycle of social reproduction that really confirms these negative stereotypes. And stereotypes matter a lot. So in the economic development community, they talk about this as gender norms. But these stereotypes really matter because it influences our credibility. I'm having an annotation request. I'm not sure what that is. Aniska, should I?
I'm not sure. I don't see it.
As Holahan Ayeni is requesting to annotate the shared content.
Hmm. Can you just
Well, I'll let him message you directly. I'm going to decline
yes,
for now.
yes, please do. I'm
Sorry
not
about
sure
that.
I don't see it, so I
Okay.
would
Um,
just keep going.
yeah, I don't know how to do that. I don't know what that is. Okay, so the stereotypes matter. It influences our credibility, in the eyes of others. It influences our confidence in ourselves, our alertness to
My hand hit
opportunities.
something by mistake. Sorry.
Sorry?
Could you repeat that?
Okay. So from stereotypes matter, that it influences the way others view us, so our credibility. It influences the way we view ourselves, our confidence. It influences our alertness to business opportunities. It influences our fear of failure. And it influences the way we access and mobilize resources for business startup. And so I think what's really important about stereotypes and why they persist is that they're actually reinforced by structural predictors. And when we're looking at top line numbers, women trailing men, that story gets told, right? We look at the report and we think, oh, there, women aren't as good at business as men. But when we actually desegregate the data and we actually look, for example, within industry sectors or by categories of business size, there we actually find an explanation for why those top line numbers are continuing to tell the story of women trailing men. Business size and industry sector are two of the most important predictors of business performance, right? All business incomes, they're necessary controls in our research studies, and they're always significant, and they always explain much of the outcomes. Negative stereotypes, of course, again, are reinforced by these top line numbers. And I think really importantly, the stereotypes that influence women's experience in business and men's experience in business start long before the entrepreneurs start their businesses, right? So, for example, gender norms influence which industries we start businesses in, and gender norms influence, whether we focus those businesses locally or whether we go after national or international markets. And we see marked gender differences in this kind of approach to business. And why does this matter? You're also probably aware that, for example, in the United States, women founders receive less than 3% of venture capital financing. Well, when you look at the global numbers, 40% of the VC dollars go to software and technology. These are the industry sectors where women are least represented. So if we go back to our chart here for ICT, that little sliver there, and it's quite a bit larger for men. And I think you can also share my concern knowing that 40% of the VC financing is going to the small slivers for both men and women, right? So we're not mobilizing capital as effectively for entrepreneurs in other industry sectors. And then for women and men, when it comes to business size, the same thing. And the question there is chicken or egg? Is it women underfunded so they don't grow their businesses as large? Or are they starting businesses in industries where small business is the way you do business? When it comes to gender and pandemic impacts, so 2020 gave us this opportunity to get our first measures. Here we're looking at the women to men ratio in a few key measures that we included in the data set. And we found a lot of gender differences varied not only between men and women, but we found a lot of variation across countries in different income brackets. So when we look at high income countries, right, we find here that women were much more likely to close their businesses compared to men as a result of the pandemic. And same with middle income countries. But in low income countries, women were less likely to. And that's probably because most of those businesses were uh, solo businesses, solo entrepreneurs for women more so than for men. And then we look at pandemic, the difficulty to start a business during the pandemic. Here again, we find that women in high income countries, the most developed nations, were much more likely to say it was difficult to start a business. And that's where we might look at factors like gender arrangements in the home, who's taking care of the kids, who had to be on site for their job and who was juggling. But we have parity in middle income and low income countries. And then when we're looking at the question of do you see a new business opportunity out of the pandemic? Um, Here again, we find that, we find some gender gap, but close to parity for high income and middle income, and women actually were more likely to report seeing an opportunity out of the pandemic in middle income or transitional economies. And then in low income economies, women were much less likely than men to report seeing opportunities. So the GEM data gives us these top line numbers that really deserve further attention unpacking, particularly in the context of factors like industry sector and business size. So I want to talk a little bit too about women in emerging economies. For a long time in the entrepreneurship world around gender and entrepreneurship, there's been this big focus on necessity versus opportunity businesses. And so women in emerging economies got painted as the poorest, least educated, least successful entrepreneurs in the world. But the GEM data has a very different story to tell around women in emerging economies. In some ways, these women are much more active in entrepreneurship than entrepreneurs from other economies. So here we look at our impact factors in high, upper middle, lower middle, and low and high income countries. And here again, we're looking at parity. So we're looking at women compared to men in terms of the ratios. And you'll see that while women in emerging economies have smaller startups, these are very small business market-based economies typically, they actually have higher growth aspirations. They have higher innovation offerings. They have lower export activity, right? Because they have a less developed export sectors in general, but they have higher rates of informal investment. So I think there's a lot more to the story than is really represented when we just talk about women's entrepreneurship in the context of necessity versus opportunity. And I think it's the high potential women entrepreneurs who are in these developing contexts who are getting the least attention, right? They're really facing some of the stiffest stereotypes. When we look at the pandemic impacts for women and men in these emerging economies, again, we see quite a lot of variation across countries. And so this speaks to the policy and the programming impacts. How do you develop policy and programming? And the caution here is you really need to tailor any interventions to the specific context, right? And so these findings, for example, are consistent with global surveys of formal registered small businesses. The GEM data allows us to examine informal activity as well as formal activity. And you can see in countries like, standout countries like Angola, the sort of least developed country in this list, women are much more likely to report closures due to the pandemic than men. But in other countries like Egypt, women were less likely to report closures than men. So what's happening specifically on the ground in these types of countries that are leading to these disparate patterns? And I'm going to suggest that a lot of this can be explained by the industries, by the nature of the market economies in these contexts. So what can we do about it? So our reports have a lot more data than I've shared with you here. These are some of the highlights. But when we're looking at what we can do about it, our conclusions in general for businesses around the world is we really need to find ways to better support growth-oriented women entrepreneurs. And we need to change that narrative because the young women who are coming forward and want to start businesses are being told that there are tons of insurmountable barriers. And so we need to get those role models out there so that they know that women are building amazing businesses in every sector today. Their stories aren't told as much as the stories of men. We need to support women entrepreneurs in male-dominated sectors. The challenge of being the minority in that sector, and this is true for people with other status characteristics, right? Who are less advantaged or less valued, and that is when you're a minority, that's when those stereotypes are most likely to be triggered. So those negative stereotypes will be used to doubt you, to limit your access, maybe to phase your own sense of self-confidence in your abilities. And we see entrepreneurs every day overcoming these barriers, and that's what's driving change. We're also seeing really important trends in women becoming investors, so learning how to use capital the way that men have historically done to create the world that they want to live in. And we're also seeing trends in women-focused investment where investors are starting to figure it out, that by excluding female founders or female markets, that they're actually missing really significant investment opportunities. So to find ways to encourage that kind of work. And then the pandemic also really showed us that we need to develop better policy that directly supports women business owners. The amusing thing about this for me, when we look at the family impacts of the pandemic, was, we saw that men were reporting family impacts at very similar levels to women in many of the entrepreneurship surveys. And that's because a lot of the dads were at home having to homeschool along with the women. And so any policy that supports family supports women. And any policy that supports small businesses, especially solo businesses, will help women entrepreneurs. And I think the United States, for the first time, actually did a pretty good job of that with by opening up the PPP funding, for example, first to the smaller companies and then to the self-employed as well. So they had an option. All right. And then emerging economies. In that report, we added a couple of extra recommendations, and that is that we don't have a lot of data about these developing contexts. We had maybe 7 countries participate in developing in the low-income category in the last GEM round, and that's something we need to change. And these are countries where they might not have a lot of budget. So we're really working to encourage international development organizations to sponsor data collection for the GEM program in these emerging economies so we can better understand what's happening there. Because again, we tend to use these stereotypes and make snap judgments about what's really happening on the ground. And we know there's a lot of heterogeneity that we need to understand better. And then finally, for emerging economies, this is also true for our last mile communities in developing context and rural communities or resource scarce communities. And that is that there's some emerging research that really supports the efficacy of launching entrepreneurship training support programs that focus on personal empowerment and those network connections. These are really profound impacts. There's some really great random control trials that have been done in developing contexts that suggest that if you were actually put these like coaching modules in with the business training, that you actually are meeting the student where they are and helping them figure out how they can realize their dreams. That's that personal empowerment piece that it's transformative. One program, for example, found that they doubled program retention and tripled revenue in 18 months by using this approach to education. And I think it's very much what we do in our higher education in the United States around the entrepreneurial mindset, right? And getting people excited about identifying ideas that they're passionate about and figuring out ways to develop strategy and execute to create businesses and move those ideas forward. And we know that where gender is concerned, there are significant differences in the types of networks that men and women have, and that's something that we're working on through different programs. So one of the powers of the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor data is that it takes an entrepreneurial process view. So I thought I would share this perspective with you, again, that offers us a caution when we're making these recommendations and tailoring them to individual contexts, because we see very different patterns across country when we're looking at um, startup intentions. So we're an adult population survey. So we ask people, are you thinking of starting a business in the next 12 months? Then we ask, well, are you doing any activities to start a business? And then we ask, well, are you paying wages? So you're an early stage business, less than 42 months old, and are you paying wages and over 42 months old? So you're established. And have you closed a business in the last 12 months? So we get these really interesting country patterns. And you can see the variety, the difference that we see here. So the women in the Middle East and North Africa region have very high intentions, but a very low startup rate. So what's going on in those contexts where women want to start businesses, but they don't even make it to nascent activity? Um, so you can look at the UAE here, and the UAE is working really, really hard to open up opportunities and support systems for women in these very, very traditional uh, cultures. And then you compare it to countries like the women in Taiwan have very high rates of established business ownership, but very low rates of intentions and startup activity in the gray here. And then women in Sweden have very low startup activity overall. Um, and I can tell you from the perspective of Scandinavia, those countries in general have very low rates of business startup and established business ownership, because as collective societies, a lot of innovation happens through big companies and through employment and through the government. So each country has very different innovation systems and entrepreneurial ecosystems that need to be understood in order to successfully conduct and interpret research in these contexts. So that gives you kind of a flavor of the GEM data. I'm going to kind of close here because I'd love there to be some good time for discussion and questions. But one of the concerns we have around this, we're always comparing men to women, is this concept of gender parity. And their international development, economic development communities are creating these value models that they um, find are really important for promoting and drawing attention to the opportunity, the investment, return on investment opportunity. As a researcher, I'm really concerned about these value models because I think they're misleading. Um, so in a Boston Consulting Group report from 2019, for example, they said that if women and men participated equally as entrepreneurs, global GDP could rise by approximately 3 to 6%, boosting the global economy by 2.5 trillion to 5 trillion. The assumption underlying this kind of value model is that women are going to stop what they're doing and start the same types of businesses and grow the businesses the same way that men do. But if we're taking a holistic view of the economy and we're not just measuring the value of business startup and growth in dollars, then we need to understand that women are already starting and growing businesses that provide, really fundamental sort of a seed bed or foundation to a prosperous economy in their local communities. Um, and we don't want to start discounting the healthcare businesses, the education, the social services, the restaurants, the dining, the fun places where women are really participating, the retail. Those are also really important categories. Again, those are sectors where we don't see a lot of entrepreneurial support and we don't see a lot of investment. So I think we need to come up with a better approach to the gender parity framing. So my bias is the system perspective. So I think we need to find ways to think about things differently. And so I'm going to urge you to remember that culture and structure, right? Those stereotypes and the industry and business size factors, that they reinforce each other. We've got the cycle of social reproduction, and social change requires that we disrupt it somewhere. Um, a lot of the focus on women's entrepreneurship historically has said, well, women need to be different, and that's implicit in that value model, right? But maybe it's the system that needs to be changed. So I think we need to model value on impact, not just dollars, I think we need to cultivate women as investors, equal participants in the mobilization of capital, to start and grow businesses. I think we need to expand the conversation too as researchers, right? We need to actually translate our findings for the lay audience there. In other research, I found a big gap between the approach to studying women's entrepreneurship among international development and what we're doing in the management literature. And I think there's a great opportunity for us all to learn from the science and generate more knowledge. And so I'm going to end here and say the Global Entrepreneurship Program, when we do these women's reports, where we like to feature women from around the world starting businesses. And it's always so inspiring to me just to see the amazing work that these women are accomplishing. This year we featured fellows from the Cartier Women's Initiative Accelerator Program. And we're expanding the conversation at DIRI. So if you're interested in following some of the work we do, you can find us at Babson, and we're on social media. And we'd love to invite you to come and share the cool work that you're doing and engage in the conversation. Thank you.